This is the Mill Pond House, or at least what is left of it. A few stone walls, a vaulted cellar, the remnants of a chimney, and ghosts of former doorways and windows. These features are all that remain of a colonial-era home built by German settlers in the mid-18th century. The surviving architectural elements are beautiful in their craftsmanship, but they also offer tantalizing clues of the early American settlers who forged a home in the wilderness of the western frontier. Today, the ancient walls of the Mill Pond House are located in the middle of the Worman's Mill development, situated in the northern part of the city of Frederick, Maryland. This modern residential community of nearly 1,500 homes is bounded by the Monocacy River and bisected by one of its tributaries, Tuscarora Creek. The ruins are a point of curiosity to its neighbors and to the people who walk along the nearby trail. Access to the site is blocked by a chain-link fence, and there is no interpretive marker to help illustrate the mill pond's place in history. As the years pass, the remaining structure continues to disintegrate. Today, the ruins are a haunting relic of a largely forgotten history. Now that a new community has built up around the Mill Pond House, people are starting to ask, what is this place?
We decided to move into Worman's Mill, and we picked out the house we wanted, but we were looking for a lot. And we first looked on one side of the island, on the Monocacy River side. Didn't like that, went over to the other side, and there was a lot next to these ruins. We didn't know what they were. It was marked on our plat, it just said ruins. And I think immediately we thought,
That's it. That's the one.
That's where we want to have our house.
First knew about the Mill Pond House ruins when we came to visit the community to pick out our site for our new home. And the impression was I was awestruck at history being in the community. To be able to see history, and there had to be a story with that.
Mill Pond, to me, is valuable to the City of Frederick because it's a colonial site. And there are so few sites that are remaining from the colonial era for us to be able to interpret and share the history of with the public, that I think it's a really valuable site.
I'm very, very interested in historic preservation in Frederick, and I think it's important to share those stories of the past with newcomers and old-time Frederick people, as well as the next generation.
The ruins are situated between the Tuscarora Creek and the Monocacy River, so we often get these thick morning mists. And to see the walls and the chimneys sticking up out of the mists, it looks like a movie set, you know, it doesn't look real. Or in the full moon and with snow on the ground, it looks like a painting.
We contacted the Frederick Landmark Association at Schifferstadt, and we were connected to Pat Ogden. And she did a bucket load of research, came out to visit us, and we took her to the ruins, and she just put her hand on the stones in the front and started talking. And she told us, this is the front of the building, this is dressed stone, this is probably when it was built. It may very well be the oldest home site in Frederick.
The Stoner family were the first owners of Mill Pond. Jacob Stoner was the patriarch of the family, and I can place him on that property in 1737. So that really is early colonial history, I think, for the City of Frederick to be able to document with documents found at the Maryland Archives and deeds and very good sources.
By examining historic documentation, we have fairly solid evidence that Jacob Stoner, a German settler, was likely squatting near or within the present-day Worman's Mill community and operating a mill near the confluence of the Monocacy River and Tuscarora Creek. It is believed that he was one of a group of colonists who were mostly German that were living in present-day Frederick without any legal claim to the land. When exactly he started living on the site is unclear, but the mill was already constructed before he legally purchased the property in 1746.
The German settlers that came to Frederick town at the time, established farms. Other than the tradesmen in the city and the merchants in the city, established grain farms. So I can't think of many more commercial enterprises that would be more important at the time than a mill, a grain mill, to be able to take the grain that the farmers grew and to process that into a finished product of flour, and then to be able to ship that out.
Understanding the historic landscape in which the house and related mill were built can be challenging now that it is surrounded by modern development. But there are a few important landmarks still in place that help set the scene. To the south of the Mill Pond House is Tuscarora Creek. This waterway would have been vital to Jacob Stoner as a source of power for his mill. An old road, colloquially known as the Old Annapolis Trail, is located approximately 650 feet to the east of the house. The specific location of the mill is unknown. Any above-ground traces of the building have been lost. However, historic maps provide an approximate setting. What is important to keep in mind is that when Jacob Stoner started building at the mill pond, he and his family would have been located approximately 3 miles north of Fredericktown, which was not yet in existence. Jacob Stoner was a pioneer, and the mill pond site harkens back to the earliest era of European settlement in Frederick. Over the past 30 years, the rural landscape around the colonial-era site was absorbed into the modern community of Worman's Mill. As time marched on and homes went up, the ruins of the Mill Pond House slowly deteriorated. More recently, a pedestrian path and biofiltration pond were constructed nearby. In 2017, with the knowledge that the Mill Pond House and surrounding land would be dedicated to the City of Frederick as parkland in the near future, the Historic Preservation Commission created the Mill Pond House Ruins Committee. This group, made up of concerned citizens and preservation professionals, was formed with the goal of obtaining grants to research, document, stabilize, and interpret the site.
You cannot go forward with anything without knowing your past. So I think that's just very critical to know where you came from and what your roots are, and explore the history of those people and those customs that came before you, so you can move forward and advance and share those stories, and hopefully, teach the next generation about what went before them.
I have concerns about the Mill Pond House because I'd like to see it stabilized. I'd really like to learn more about it and to be able to share the history that we have sitting there in the community.
Yeah, we were anxious for the ruins to come under city control as soon as possible. When it's privately owned, you never know what's going to happen, if someone's going to change their mind or whatever. So we wanted to get this in the public's hands so it would be preserved and have its story told.
Ultimately, the goal of the committee is to stabilize the Mill Pond House ruins so that people can more closely interact with the site and understand its history. However, the first step in this project is to fully research and document the property. After discussions with the Maryland Historical Trust, the committee successfully pursued a grant to perform an archaeological investigation. As the archaeologists pursue underground deposits, historians and architectural historians were asked to the site and to share their observations on the remaining structure. The public, along with students and city officials, were invited to learn with the committee. This public outreach generated unexpected opportunities to utilize modern technology to further explore the site. Will all of this effort help us find a deeper understanding of the Mill Pond House? The committee was not the first to take interest in the colonial-era site. The earliest formal investigation of the ruins occurred in 1953, when Henry Chandley Foreman documented the Mill Pond House. Foreman was a well-respected historian, architect, and artist, and his collection of notes, photographs, and drawings provides us with detailed documentation of the house while it still stood. A brief notation at the top of one of his sketches effectively sums up the building's condition at the time: a house dangerous in ruins. Still, the Mill Pond House had retained enough of its original features for Worman to capture a detailed portrait of the early Frederick home. He described its importance to colonial architecture as one of the prize finds in the state, and it was. The Mill Pond House was modeled after late medieval dwellings of the Upper Rhine region in Germany. Of note is the stonework on the foundation and first-story levels, while the upper part of the building was constructed of wattle and daub walls set between timber framing. The cellar features a vaulted ceiling, walls with small niches for storing goods, and a vent to provide airflow. The interior arrangement of the house was consistent with William Penn's Quaker plan. The central chimney and winding staircase divided the first floor into unequal halves. The east half contained a large parlor and chamber, while the west half consisted of the kitchen. Worman surmised that the kitchen would have originally served the purposes of a medieval great hall where cooking, dining, and socializing occurred. Mill Pond House was an impressive structure for its era, and the kitchen was considered the largest in colonial Maryland before being partitioned into smaller rooms. Also of note was the central fireplace, which was large enough to accommodate logs up to 8 feet in length. In 1984, Orlando Rideout from the Maryland Historical Trust visited the ruinous home. He documented that some of the stone walls were still standing and that the cellar was intact, and that some elements of the interior framing were still in reasonably good condition. The center chimney had collapsed. Possibly around the time of Rideout's visit, several photographs of Mill Pond House were taken by an unidentified photographer and were recently reproduced by the City of Frederick. In the 1990s, development began on the Worman's Mill community, its name likely derived from the Worman family that owned the property in the 19th century. As construction of new homes began near the Mill Pond House, there was growing interest in the site. 2 residents, Claggett Jones and Wes Stewart, built a detailed replica based on their research and on-site observations.
Look how well this is held up and how much labor it took to build this stuff when each one of those had to be done by hand and all that mud mix. And it's just tremendous to me.
The stonework wasn't the only point of curiosity. There is also the mystery of the terrible fire that took place on the property in the spring of 1748.
The evidence of the fire, it's first noted actually in the Maryland Gazette, the official newspaper of Maryland, published in Annapolis during the colonial period. It was mentioned that Jacob Stoner's house was consumed by fire. One of his sons was so injured that his life was despaired of. From the Maryland Gazette, I go to the Maryland Archives, where just a few days later, Jacob Stoner petitions the Assembly for $200. He asks for $200 that he lost in the fire of his house. So that's a great record, the official archive.
Since there is documentation of a fire, it begs the question, do the remaining ruins reflect the first home on the site?
Yeah, and we were actually talking about this as we walked around the site earlier today. Whether or not this was the site of a first-generation dwelling is unclear. Part of architectural history research tends to focus on the progression of buildings over time. The first-generation building, the second-generation building, third generation. In general, but not always, each of those buildings will increase in size, scale, style, to reflect the growth of prosperity of the particular property owner. My theory would be that this was definitely skilled masons that constructed this building.
If early settlers were initially building modest structures that were replaced or added onto by larger and more ornate structures, then it's possible that the ruins that we see today are not from the original home on the property. The remnants of the Mill Pond House indicate that it was a large home that was finely crafted. It's possible that this is the original house that was damaged by fire and rebuilt. Would this explain the variation in stonework seen on the south elevation? Perhaps the archaeological evidence will provide new clues. What is clear is that the Mill Pond House at one time exhibited all the hallmarks of a German-styled medieval home, including its interior layout, central chimney, steep roof, and thick walls with small, irregularly placed windows. The cellar area is also uniquely German.
So we're standing next to the cellar of Mill Pond House. It's a stone masonry barrel vaulted cellar, very large in size, extends the full width or depth, I should say, from the front of the house to the back of the house and pretty much from the center of the house over. These were common features of German colonial architecture in this area. It was used for all kinds of meat storage, vegetable storage, dairy storage. In the far end, the north end, there are two features of note. There is a ventilation shaft. Also, there are niches built into that north wall, and those would have been used to set jars of, say, dairy products and things you wanted to keep off the ground. There are several other examples of this cellar construction in the area.
After learning from historic records and from the building itself, it was time to focus on the archaeological investigation. The City of Frederick, in consultation with the Mill Pond House Ruins Committee and with support from Maryland Historical Trust grant funds, hired AECOM to perform the work. Peter Regan served as the head principal investigator for the project.
So good archaeology starts with a good approach. It starts with a carefully considered scientific method to go out and make sure that the kind of data you're collecting is the best kind of data that's available to you. Now, good archaeology takes that scientific approach to a more humanistic level when it tries to tell a good story with the data that's available to it. Not one that's fabricated, but one that's true to the archaeological record that's discovered, but one which, if possible, is made relatable and relevant to a public that may be a stakeholder in the resource itself.
One of the principal goals of the project was to locate the long-lost mill. Lacking visible evidence on the surface, the archaeologists targeted a general area based on historic maps and existing features by performing a shovel test pit survey.
So we're not exactly sure where the mill would have been located. Trying to georeference historic mapping against modern spatial data leaves a lot of room for error. So it's very difficult to get any kind of precision when it comes to doing that. So what we did was we took as many of the historic maps as we could, amalgamated them, gave the best approximate location that we could come up with based on those maps, and then went out and did a shovel test survey. So every 50 feet we would dig a hole at the grid coordinates in an effort to locate any remnant of the mill whatsoever. And all of that took place on the floodplain of Tuscarora Creek, and we found nothing. No nails, no glass, nothing architectural, nothing at all to tell us that anything was ever built there. We saw pieces of Annapolis Road, the bridge abutments, retaining walls, what might be part of the mill race. But one reason that we may not be seeing the mill is because in a 1904 deed, the person who was selling the property reserved the right to retain access to it to come back at a later date and remove the mill brick by brick. So it's very possible that there's nothing at all left, not even foundation remains.
The idea that the mill was removed from the site by the early 20th century is not only supported by the 1904 deed and the archaeological record, but a U.S. Geological Survey map from 1908 shows that the mill has been removed by that point in time. An article published on Mill Pond House in the local periodical The News on December 1, 1951, includes some insights into its period of abandonment. This article notes that the mill was long ago raised, but once stood near the house. The mill race, which was the channel carrying the fast-moving water to drive the mill wheel, had been filled in and plowed over. The nearby Annapolis Road was closed around the turn of the century. With the loss of the mill between 1904 and 1908, and the abandonment of the road around the same time, it seems likely that the house would have also been abandoned around the first quarter of the 20th century. Without success in finding the mill, attention was redirected to the mill house itself.
We laid out a grid of shovel test pits on 5-meter intervals, excavated around the house, a bit to the east, a bit to the west, did not go north due to the housing development, did not go south due to the biofiltration ponds and path. And essentially, as we went through and dug each one of those, we paid very close attention to the quantity and variety of artifacts that were coming out, and tried to see if there was any kind of meaningful horizontal patterning, areas where a lot of artifacts cluster, area where there are very few. And our test units were based in part on the results of that initiative. But we also took into account the way in which the home was used. And using the extant floor plans from 1953, we've determined, of course, that the rear part of the west half of the house would have been the kitchen, where a lot of the debris would have been discarded through that back or north door. So that was one of the main focuses, because that's where you're going to find your greatest degree of artifacts and potential features.
Kitchen artifacts account for over 57% of all artifacts found on the site, and the finds include more than 1,500 found objects, mainly ceramics and glass. Unfortunately, most of the kitchen ceramics were too fragmented to identify their original form, whether they were part of a cup or plate. The most common period represented by the ceramics is between the mid-19th and early 20th century. However, other items date to the earliest habitation of the site, such as this fragment of a tobacco pipe, which dates from 1720 to 1750. Early settlers at the Mill Pond House had access to tobacco and enjoyed a good smoke. Here, the fragment from Mill Pond is compared to a replica clay pipe. This wrought nail, which dates back to before 1790, was likely used during the earliest phase of occupation of the home. While this little piece of a toy porcelain cup shows that the Mill Pond property wasn't just about milling, it was a place where children grew up. Interestingly, it may be what was not found on the site that is the most telling. A major clue that tells us if the Mill Pond House was the earliest home on the site.
Is Mill Pond House the original house on the property? No. We don't know that for sure. I shouldn't say it so definitively, but the archaeological evidence and the documentary evidence suggests that since Jacob Stoner was living on the property prior to 1746 when we actually purchased it, it's unlikely that he would have built such a grand structure on land he didn't even own yet. So, common with a lot of other German settlers, first-generation German settlers, who needed to focus more on bringing land under cultivation or getting, in this case, a mill up and running, he likely would have built an expedient, temporary dwelling for himself and his family, and only once his economic prosperity was stable would he have then built the larger house, the Mill Pond House that we see the ruins of today. There is some documentary evidence that suggests that Jacob Stoner's home burned in 1748, and for a long time it was thought that that was Mill Pond House. But in fact, we found no evidence whatsoever for a catastrophic fire. We didn't find a piece of charcoal. So if in fact this house had burned, we would really expect much more evidence in the archaeological record for it, but it just isn't there. So instead, the house that burned was likely the original one that he had built for himself while a squatter on the property. And Mill Pond House was either under construction at this time, or it may have been built as a response to the fire as a replacement home for the family that had just lost theirs.
Although the archaeological investigation revealed new insights into the history of the Mill Pond House, there were significant limitations. For one, there was no archaeological evidence showing the mill's location, and no other outbuildings or landscape features were identified. While a wide variety of artifacts were recovered from the yard around the house, the objects were generally located in disturbed ground. When artifacts are mixed up in the ground caused by plowing, construction, or other activity, the ability to analyze any particular artifact or attribute it to a particular person or time period is greatly hindered. However, the interior of the ruins could not be archaeologically evaluated yet because of stone debris and safety hazards. Within the walls, the archaeological deposits may be more intact and yield more clues. Now that the archaeological investigation is over, are the Mill Pond House ruins significant?
So is the Mill Pond House site significant? There are a lot of answers to it. In one sense, no. The archaeological deposits that we investigated exterior to the house, they're not significant in the sense that they can't contribute important information to local history, and so therefore aren't eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. But the site might be eligible for the National Register if archaeological excavation can be undertaken inside of the Mill Pond House foundation itself. Now, we couldn't have excavated in there due to safety concerns and due to the fact that it's filled with a lot of stone rubble. But if the walls were able to be stabilized and if the rubble could be removed, archaeological deposits associated with the kitchen or the fantastic vaulted cellar underneath the east half of the house could yield intact archaeological deposits because they haven't been submitted to the same kind of disturbances that the rest of the property has. And then lastly, yes, Mill Pond House is very significant. It's significant to the community. It's significant to the city as a cultural touchstone for an era from which so few examples still survive. It's important to anybody who sees it, whether they live in Worman's Mill or just enjoying the recreational paths that pass by it. It's something that I've seen people marvel at and wonder at and ask questions of and care about. And that rises to a higher order of significance than any legal designation ever could.
Public education and outreach were important aspects of this project. During the archaeological fieldwork, members of the community, students, and public officials were invited to the site. And after the archaeological investigation was complete, the findings were shared with the public. Along the way, unexpected opportunities arose. For one, after the archaeological fieldwork was complete, the city's engineering department went to the site to perform additional work to document the ruins. With the aid of a new Leica laser, the engineers scanned the walls of the ruins with a laser light, which was then reflected back to the instrument. The amount of time it takes for the laser to travel back and forth from individual points on the wall surface creates a measurement that is calculated and stored. In total, the scanners measured almost 2.5 million points. The resulting images provide a detailed rendition of the Mill Pond House, capturing perspectives that were previously unavailable. Looking down upon the ruins, we can clearly see how the second-story wood frame structure would have rested onto the stone walls of the first story. This scan shows the layout of the underground cellar, including the interior entrance. Details of known features, like the niches in the wall, were captured, but engineers also documented elements that are less prominent, such as the ventilation shaft off the north elevation. In a final effort to capture another perspective on the Mill Pond House, drones were utilized to capture new views. The city was able to get access to equipment that has the capability of flying indoors, allowing us to get detailed images of the cellar area. Another drone went high above the ground to show how the historic site fits into the Worman's Mill community. After the examination of the Mill Pond House history, our thoughts naturally turned to its future. The remaining walls, though expertly crafted, are no longer structurally anchored to each other, and observers have noticed gradual deterioration.
You know, every time there's a storm, we're wondering what's going to come down, but eventually it's going to start crumbling even more, and we'd like to catch it and stabilize it as soon as we can.
I would like to see the property end up with maybe some placards to tell us about some of the things that have been found in the archaeological exploration. And I'd like to see it made a little bit more stable so you could feel safe that it was going to be around for longer.
Ultimately, along with my research at Schifferstadt, I really want to connect the Frederick community to its colonial history.
Yes, we would like to see it stabilized and sort of kept in this current condition, and so maybe sometime several hundred years from now someone can reconstruct it, but just to save the site and let everyone know what the history of this place is and how important it is to the City of Frederick.
Ultimately, the Mill Pond House Committee wants to investigate the best methodologies to stabilize and interpret the site. Funding sources such as grants will need to be explored, but there is hope. With the continued support and interest from the community, the ruins may remain and give future generations tangible clues to the colonial history located in our backyard. Learn more about Frederick's Historic Preservation Commission. Go to www.cityoffrederick.com/preservation.